All right, it's noon. Are we ready to go ahead and get started, Jessica?
I am if Alex is ready to go.
I believe we are ready.
Perfect.
Jessica, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Oh, you muted yourself.
Oh, I'm Jessica Merkling, and I'm the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And then I guess, Morgan, did you want to do your quick introduction before I get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, guys. I'm Morgan Sussman. I'm with DNR Fish and Wildlife as well. I'm one of their outreach specialists. So I will be helping you guys in the background with questions today. If you are not familiar with Microsoft Teams, the chat box, if you're on a desktop or a computer, the chat box is the little show conversation icon up in the top, kind of towards the right. And if you're on mobile, it's in the top right-hand corner, same icon. So we are going to be recording this webinar and we're going to be posting it on our website here in probably a couple weeks. But if you're here now, you get to see it in person. So with that, I think we're ready to go.
Sounds good. I will get started. Can everyone see the screen okay? The presentation okay?
Yep, we can see it here.
Perfect. See if I can get. As Morgan mentioned, my name is Jessica Merkling, and I'm the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. We do also have a South Urban Biologist. Her name is Erin, and I believe. Oh, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. Can everyone still hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll keep going then. Erin Bassinger, she's our other urban biologist down south. She was going to be presenting with me today, but she has some things come up, so I think she'll still be around for potentially the questions afterwards. So thank you to the Lilly Center for inviting me to do this lunch and learn with you today. And with that, I will get started with the presentation. So as I mentioned, I'm a North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist. I cover Elkhart, Fort Wayne, and South Bend and some of their surrounding cities. And then our South Urban Biologist covers Indianapolis and some of the surrounding cities as well. These are the primary areas where we can do things like habitat work, but we do have the entirety of the counties of St. Joe, Elkhart, Allen, Hamilton, Marion, Hendricks, and Johnson counties. And new this year, we have the entire state of Indiana for all Canada goose permits. So that is why Erin and I did this presentation to talk today. And then Morgan graciously agreed to help us with the technical side of things. So if you're ever confused about which biologist you need to contact, we do have a link to that. If you go to in.gov/DNR, you can go to the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and we do have a list of our wildlife biologists if you ever need assistance. So being the urban biologist, that means we work under what we call our 4 pillars, and those pillars include living with wildlife, promoting sustainable natural resource planning and development strategies, developing, improving, and acquiring urban wildlife habitat, and then promoting conservation appreciation. So for living with wildlife, essentially it's managing wildlife conflicts, managing human-wildlife conflicts with people. So most of the time that looks like us answering phone calls and emails and answering questions about what people can and cannot do to help either improve their habitat or to address a conflict with some wildlife that they're having. But it also means that we work with the communications team like Morgan to give out information regarding living with wildlife, such as coyotes. We also do a lot of media requests and interviews. And then being the urban biologist, Erin and I are charged every year to do the annual Waterfowl Workshop. And what that does is we train waterfowl control operators in the state of Indiana on canada-geese-management techniques so that they can do it for hire throughout the state. That includes things such as trapping, relocating, and euthanizing Canada geese. This pillar, so essentially just promoting green infrastructure and sustainability, it's its own pillar, but realistically, most often just kind of gets rolled into the other ones organically. because it's about promoting things like conservation-friendly practices, such as using prescribed fire for habitat management, or when you're designing maybe a park, going to meetings and discussing ways to maybe mitigate Canada goose conflicts or incorporate pollinator habitat, those types of things. We spend most of our time on the part where it's about developing and improving and acquiring urban wildlife habitat, and that actually ties in quite a lot with Canada goose management, and we will talk about why that is later. But essentially, as part of this, we do have cost share funding available to us for certain projects, and those projects usually have to fall within those city limits of those cities that we mentioned at the beginning for putting, but essentially we have money to give back a portion of the cost incurred by a landowner for putting habitat in the ground. That can be a rain garden, it can be a pollinator garden, maybe it's a prairie. Depending on what it is, we can usually work with you. But these are just some examples of before and afters of some projects that the urban program has worked on. And then the final pillar is called promoting conservation appreciation. So historically before COVID, that was things like going to state fair, hosting workshops for hunting, fishing, and trapping, but also attending things like the Monarch Festival in Fort Wayne. I've also been out to some county fairs, and coming up soon, I know we are involved to some degree with the city area nature challenges. So we do a little bit of different things for conservation appreciation as well. But, oh no. But the best thing that we can do is when we can actually combine those pillars. So this is an example of a place in Village Farms down around Carmel, Indiana, where you can see on the far left here, there's some water there. And if you look really closely at the sidewalk, they were having some conflicts with Canada geese. So they wanted to address the Canada goose conflict, as well as create a beautiful area for pollinators. And another part that you can't see is in the back, they wanted to work on some shoreline erosion issues. So where we can, we like to combine those pillars. And this is another example of how we did that with students and planting a plot to talk about native plantings and native vegetation and why it's beneficial to wildlife. And then we also taught the high school students that came out and helped plant around our office when we replaced our invasive burning bush with a bunch of native wildflowers. So that was the quick rundown of the urban program. So now we're actually going to get into why you guys are all here today, and that is to talk about Canada geese. We're going to talk about their life histories, some potential conflicts, some different management strategies, and then as a last resort, we'll talk about the permitting process if that is something that a person needs to pursue. First, we'll talk about their life history, and it's important to know that before European settlement, the giant Canada geese were really common throughout the upper Midwest, including Indiana. But before the 1960s, it was believed that they were extinct from Indiana, and that was due to a lot of different things, such as unregulated hunting, habitat loss, including wetland drainage, unrestricted egg harvest. So a lot of those similar stories that we've had for example, white-tailed deer in Indiana or river otters in Indiana. So this is another example of one of those species that we pretty much drove out of the state from various different reasons. But in 1962, Dr. Hansen actually found a remnant population of these giant Canada geese in Minnesota. So what they did when they found this remnant population, they took from this population and started redistributing the geese to the other states throughout the Midwest to improve their numbers again. So essentially things like back in Indiana a long time ago, they had this A Goose for You Too program where properties and lakes could actually apply to have mating pairs brought out to their properties to help bolster the population of Canada geese in Indiana. And then other things that helped, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act helped a little with conservation of geese. This was technically in place prior to the Indiana extinction of Canada geese. However, things got improved and better, and that helped to bolster the species again. For what Canada geese look like, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think most people here know what one looks like, but we will go down some of the things to look for. They typically have the gray-brown wings and backs. They have the light gray to brown sides and breasts. They have the black tails, feet, legs, bills, and heads. And they have those white patches on the cheek. Typically, they weigh between 3 and 24 pounds, but on average, they're probably in that 12 to 15 pound range. Typically, males are larger than the females. And what we're seeing here on this picture is just showing you that it can be a little bit tricky to distinguish a juvenile from the adult. But things to look for to help distinguish, one of the first things is these downy feathers, and you can see real good on the one behind this one. But anytime there's downy feathers on the bird, that's a really good indicator that it is a juvenile. Adults will not have those feathers. Additionally, Canada geese, after talking to our waterfowl biologists, and it's something that I never really paid attention to, but juveniles tend to let out more of a squawk than a honk, where the adults will make that really distinctive honking sound. Other things to look for is the really distinct edges of the feathers here. The adults on the bottom here, and you can kind of see really clearly what those edges are, the sharp contrast between the head and the neck, whereas it's a little more fuzzy on a juvenile and not so distinctive. They're also pretty easily identified from flying in a V formation, and again, that distinctive honk, especially in those adults. The other part of that is there are actually multiple Canada goose species. There's 11 different recognized subspecies of Canada geese, and they all vary because of their size, their plumage, their distribution, and their habitats. But when we talk about Canada geese for their management in Indiana, we're typically talking about those giant Canada geese. Some sources have 11 subspecies, some say 7, but in general, when we talk about Canada geese in Indiana, it's just important to remember that we're referring specifically to the giant Canada goose. Geese are a migratory species, which means they have a migration pattern and they fly the same routes every year. So they go south in the fall and they come back north in the spring, and it happens every year in cycle form. Historically, many of these geese migrate, and we are currently doing some research in Indiana in urban areas to see how far these geese are migrating. Some studies have suggested that they may stay within their state of birth or maybe go to a couple of neighboring states. But what we have found with our banding data in Indiana, we have had geese captured in the far northern territories of Canada. And we also have found in our preliminary urban studies that some of the geese coming through all look like Canada geese. So what may appear to be the same geese all the time are actually different geese cycling through the area. Again, they start moving south in the fall and then north in the spring, and they generally like to keep returning to where they hatch or have learned to fly. And that's why a lot of people see geese coming back to their same nesting sites year after year. There are some populations of birds that don't migrate at all, and that's usually typically due to things like feeding and other components, which we will discuss later. Canada geese start looking for their nesting sites in February and March, sometimes earlier if the weather conditions are right. Usually they mate starting around 2 and 3 years old, and they mate for life. That can be taken with a grain of salt, because while they do mate for life, if they do lose a partner, they will find a new partner if necessary. They typically like to build their nests within 150 feet of water. And then they actually, after they've scouted for their nesting sites and built the nest, they actually start their mating season throughout late February, March, April. Once they've mated, a female will lay 1 egg every day and a half until she typically has about 5 to 7 eggs. And then once that last egg is laid, the female will incubate the nest for about 28 days. During that time, both the male and the female will defend the nest pretty actively, and that's usually the time where we have a lot of our conflicts. And Canada geese, they have this really strong nesting instinct. So if their nest is destroyed or improperly destroyed, they will likely re-nest. Some of their feeding habits, when they choose their nesting locations, it's really important for Canada geese to have access to food. They're grazers, so they eat large amounts of grasses and forbs or wildflowers in the spring and the summer. They will eat different types of grains, grasses, seeds, sedges, aquatic vegetation, and other vegetation. But the tender grass and those fertilized lawns is their absolute favorite. They also really like that less than 6-inch height vegetation. As I mentioned, they'll eat other types of vegetation, including legumes. They will eat waste grains from crops later in the year. But they really like that Kentucky bluegrass. That is just their favorite. Again, they like to nest within walking distance of water, and that's typically where they like to feed as well. And if you look in this picture, you can see that there's nothing really inhibiting my line of sight way clear back into here. That's what Canada geese like. They're looking around and they have no reason to believe that a predator is coming after them. So that's another indicator of what they like and where they like to eat. So what that means for goose habitat is, again, they like those open spaces with clear visibility and access to water. So that can be wetlands, marshes, rivers, lakes, and urban ponds. And this is one of those urban ponds. And you can kind of see all this grass open here, the water structure, clear line of sight. Geese are, their behavior, they're typically active during the day. They like to spend most of their time grazing and tending to their nests. They will defend their territories, and they often can roost in large flocks together on the banks of water bodies. And again, that's one of the other areas where we tend to have some human goose conflicts. In the wild, Canada geese can live up 20 plus years. There is documentation of a 30-year-old female goose that has survived in the wild, but their average age is probably about 10 years old. Once they get to adulthood, survivorship is actually very, very high, so up to more than 90% survive. The largest threat to Canada geese once they're adults is humans, whether that be through hunting, vehicle accidents, direct persecution. Those are the biggest threats to their survival. There is some threat from coyotes and domestic dogs. But if you think about we talked about how they're 12 to 15 pounds and coyotes aren't super large either. So it takes a lot of effort to bring down an adult Canada goose. So again, domestic dogs could be problematic for Canada geese. And then the biggest threat to their survival is actually when they're still eggs and young. So you have things like egg predators that'll come in and take those eggs out, or obviously some of our mammals will pick off some of the smaller goslings. When we talk about Canada geese, some of the potential conflicts we have, they essentially have had really great success in bringing them back, right? But that success has actually led to some conflicts in urban areas. They've had a successful recovery to many different things. So in addition to getting regulation of hunting under control, protecting their habitat, Canada geese are very adaptable to urban and suburban environments, which is where we have most of the conflict. In those areas, they also often have a lack of hunting for a variety of reasons. One of them being local ordinances that prohibit the dispatching of firearms. But then additionally, there's also some obvious safety components in urban areas for not all areas can be hunted. In urban areas, there's definitely some public interest, and there's definitely groups of people that really like to see Canada geese. So that can help, that can influence people attracting geese to those areas. Again, there's new protections and laws and ordinances. But the bigger thing is, as we keep expanding our urban areas, we keep creating these large open grassy areas next to water, and we just essentially keep creating primal habitat for Canada geese. So in urban areas, as we start changing the environment, we actually unintentionally or intentionally can create these niches for other wildlife to fit into, such as Canada geese with the large open areas. And that can increase the human-wildlife interaction. And for some people, that can be really positive, but it can also be negative. So with success, we just really have to keep watching how the interaction with Canada geese has changed. Common concerns that come with Canada goose conflicts or geese gathering in large numbers, obviously the public health and safety. A lot of people are really concerned about the health and safety from poop. After talking pretty extensively with a waterfowl biologist about this, there's not really great research that has significant risk health threats from geese to humans. It's just not well documented in any of the research. But there are obvious diseases that can be associated with geese that can include things like avian influenza, salmonella, cholera, those types of things. So obviously, it's still something we have to think about. For a lot of people, some concern is from their pets eating the feces. And for those types of concerns, we would actually have to direct you to your veterinarian to answer those questions. Other concerns that happen is property and crop damage. We do have a lot of corn and soybean fields in Indiana, and we do have farmers that do have large flocks of geese that can do damage to their crops. Another issue is noise. They can be particularly noisy. There have been some neighborhoods that have complained strictly just about the noise. They can cause traffic hazards. This is especially problematic in some of the highly urbanized areas because a lot of people tend to slow down for the geese, and that can back up traffic. But on the flip side of that, you also have people going through and geese crossing roads in busy areas where it could potentially lead to the geese being hit on the road. And then it may not be at the top of everyone's minds, but there are definitely divided attitudes about how Canada geese should be managed. So, you know, you definitely have people on both ends of the spectrum. So it's really important to notice that and mitigate that when you're thinking about your management plan or how you're going to handle these geese. Most people have probably seen some type of defensive posture from a Canada goose, or else you probably wouldn't have been here today to talk about Canada geese. But some of those postures to look for if you're trying to educate people about staying away, things like head pumping, that open bill. I'm assuming this goose was definitely probably hissing, honking, wing flapping, just an aggressive posture. Most of the time this happens because they're defending their nests. As you would expect almost any animal or human to do, they're defending their young. That's a normal behavior. Most injuries happen during this time when people turn to try and run, and then they end up tripping and falling. So, and that becomes especially important in areas where maybe you have small children, maybe you have a senior community, or in areas like a medical area where you have people recovering and various degrees of ability to walk with various degrees of assistance. So that's when it becomes more of an issue. So after giving all that background, we're going to get more into the management nitty-gritty details. But before I get into that, I really think it's important to remember that in all of this, for just like any other management for any other wildlife species, there is no one-time fix that will always work 100% of the time and will ever address 100% of the geese. That's just not realistic. Wildlife management is a constantly changing thing, and we have to always adapt accordingly and make observations of what did or did not work. And then we have to be flexible and open to changing our behaviors when necessary. So when we talk about Canada goose management, there's usually 3 H's that we teach our waterfowl control operators, and that's hunting, harassment, and habitat changes. And when you're looking at these different goose management options, the best thing to start doing is to come up with a comprehensive management plan. So you're going to look at what is the issue you're trying to address, what combination of tools are you or are you not willing to use, what is the end result that you're looking for, and then once you implement that plan, it's important to do it, review it, and then adjust to see what worked or didn't work. So hunting, that is the first H. Hunting in the legal season is the preferred method of removing surplus waterfowl. Obviously, that's not always an option in urban areas due to safety and ordinances, but it is a valid and good option. The money from the sale of hunting licenses goes back to conservation, which benefits all wildlife, not just Canada geese. In addition to being good for conservation, hunting creates a recreational opportunity, and it is a healthy food source for people. As we already mentioned, this can be hard in densely populated areas because of either real or perceived safety concerns and local ordinances. But there are seasons, generally September through February. They're divided by north, south, and central zones. And those are the times where, if it's viable, that is a really good option to support. This is your typical goose management schedule. This just kind of shows you the time of year where you have to start looking. So that November through February, that's when you want to make your schedule, make your plans, hunting in the legal season. Then you really need to think about harassing in February, March, April, when they're starting to scout for those locations, because it's really important to start addressing the behavior early in the year, because that's when you'll have the most success. Then, as necessary, once they start nesting and laying their eggs, that's when you do egg and nest destruction. In June and July, Canada geese actually molt their flight feathers, and it becomes kind of unethical to keep harassing and torturing them because they physically can't go anywhere. So this is where you should already helpfully have your fencing in place, because that's your fencing should be in place before up here, because then your fencing is going to have to take over and be your predominant mode of protection during this time. And then this is also the time of year when, if you pursue a permit, that's when you're going to be doing the trapping and relocating or euthanizing. And then you have harassment again in the intermittent time when you're not hunting. And it's important to know that this is a multifaceted approach for the appropriate types of actions to be taken at appropriate times of year. And we're going to get into all of these. Usually just harassment, you have to be consistent, you have to do it varied, and it has to be really unpredictable. Contrary to popular belief, Canada geese are incredibly smart birds, and they will actually learn, and if it's not varied and if it's the same thing all the time, they're going to get used to it, and they're not going to, and then harassment techniques are just not going to be as potent. So again, you're looking at the appropriate time of year. If you're using harassment alone, you're going to probably looking at least 2 weeks, if not longer. It just takes a long time, especially if they've already got an established routine going. It's going to be a lot harder to get them off the property. Harassment is legal as long as the birds are not physically harmed. And again, you have to kind of think about, is it ethical to be harassing a mom on her nest or chasing geese around when they can't do anything about it, like when they're molting their feathers. If you have a severe issue, it's better recommended that you do a combination of techniques, better than just one single technique. And again, you really should start implementing these harassment as soon as the problem is noticed. Unfortunately, a lot of times I get a call, well, the geese have been here for 2 months and now I want them gone. Well, now they've had an established pattern for 2 months. So now we have to untrain that 2 months of learned behavior. And again, harassment is not a long-term solution. This is just one tool for short-term solutions that should be integrated into all the other tools. I mentioned it takes probably at least 2 weeks. These are 3 different schedules here, A, B, and C. As you can see, A is probably the best type of harassment schedule. It covers a complete 2 weeks. The times are really varied, different staff, different times. B, they kind of have the variation, but they only really do it for 1 week, and then it kind of falls off. And then C, there's no type of schedule going on. So you can see how you can get better with that. Types of harassment include audio, visual, and physical harassment. All of these are contingent upon following all of your local ordinances. Harassing Canada geese does not override any local ordinances, so just bear that in mind. So you can do things like air horns and whistles and firecrackers and distress calls. Again, it's really important to vary this. I have had a person that they played distress calls for Canada geese, but what ended up happening is they played the exact same sound at the exact same time for the exact same length of time every day. And now the Canada geese just kind of swim by it and don't really care because they learn nothing's really happening. Other types of noisemakers are an option. If you're doing visual, there's things like mylar tape, motion sensor lights, scarecrows, lasers, flagging, the eye spot balloons. These are really good options. I think there's been a lot of research with the green lasers right now. So long as you're not blinding the poor bird with a laser in the eye, those are all things to think about. It's important to know, like for the scarecrow portion, Effigies are more effective if you actually keep moving them around, just like when I talked about with the distress calls. If they see that that statue of a coyote never moves, they're going to eventually figure out that that's not a real coyote. So that's something to think about. A lot of people still like the idea of using mute swans. Mute swans are invasive, destructive, and they've been shown to attract more geese. So mute swans are really not a good, live mute swans are really not a good option at all. It's really not a preferred option, and it's just introducing an invasive species onto the landscape, and that's never a good idea. Physical techniques can be things like spraying with a water hose. You can do low pressure water, obviously, because when you're harassing a goose, it means you can't physically harm it. So you can't be doing like a high-powered water washer on that poor bird. You can use dogs for chasing, but it is important to know that if your dogs are chasing Canada geese, you as the dog owner are responsible to make sure your dog does not harm that bird. Other things can include things like remote-controlled boats, cars, and those types of things. Human behavior modification is probably the biggest thing that we can do because it educates ourselves and others and empowers ourselves and others to really learn about wildlife. And it's our best effort to really start addressing some of these more common wildlife issues. So things like learning to support hunting in areas where it's safe and legal to do so, learning how to actually develop a cohesive management plan and following it, advocating for developing habitat in other areas, and then adopting and strictly enforcing a no-feeding policy, and that will be followed up with local legislator. We often see a lot of people that post signs about not feeding waterfowl, but I'm sure many of you have seen people feeding birds right next to the sign that says don't feed the waterfowl. So it's really important to think about why you don't do it and actually enforcing why it shouldn't be done. So some of the no feeding policies, and we can easily talk about the intentional feeding, right? So that's feeding bread, leaving food out for wildlife, intentionally going to the water's edge and throwing bread in. But there's other things to think about as well. That include accidental feeding. So accidentally spilled garbage, leaving your pet food out. If you have bird feeders out, think about how birds are such messy eaters and they often spill bird food. So that bird food can go on the ground and also attract Canada geese. So that's really important to think about that. Other negative effects of feeding waterfowl, and not just waterfowl, but wildlife in general, you could be intentionally attracting non-target species. So if you put up a bird feeder for one bird, but you're attracting a Canada geese, your Canada goose is your non-target species that's being attracted. Things like habituation, so they become dependent on humans for food sources. As such, they can become more aggressive to get food later, and then they can also lose their fear of humans. It can also disrupt their natural behaviors, so they can burn through their fat reserves in the wintertime, and then you can potentially delay or eliminate migration. And like I said, we do have some populations that are doing that. You can risk spreading diseases, and you can also just induce diseases. This is a sign at a nature museum that shows angel wing, which is a condition that affects waterfowl, but it's essentially thought to be caused by feeding birds high levels of carbs and sugar, so bread, essentially. And then the other part, which we've already talked about multiple times, is when you feed birds, you can potentially overcrowd them, which again fosters spreading disease. And then you get aggression towards other geese, other birds, people, pets, those types of things. Other negative effects of feeding can be on your property itself. So things like overgrazing, you can degrade your landscape. You can see here where they've picked it clean and you can kind of see the mud for soil erosion. And you can see out here along this shoreline, which it's not all Canada goose related because I'm sure there's some fertilizer in there as well. But all that runoff has degraded some of the water quality, especially right here. And then again, with those human health concerns. So habitat modification is the preferred and most long-term solution method of managing Canada geese. Essentially, a lot of that is just incorporating native plants, and that can be grasses, it can be wildflowers, shrubs, trees, all those things. And then you also want to eliminate those features that attract geese, and then blocking line of sight and easy access to water. And for putting in some of those habitats, that's where the urban cost share funding for certain projects can be used. If you're in an area that's not one of the urban coverage areas, you can reach out to your other district biologists to see what their availability is. It's probably pretty low, but if nothing else, we should be able to find ways to get you technical assistance of how to put it in the ground. Other types of changes are physical barriers, so overhead line or grid wires. So this is just a little water body and we put grid lines on it. You can kind of see what the idea would look like. You can use Kevlar, rope, mylar tape, something that's highly visible so that the birds can see, like if they're flying over and looking for a place to come to the water, you want that grid to be really visible so they just know to avoid it. You usually want the overhead grid to be about 1 to 2 feet off the ground, and this will restrict landing and takeoff of geese. You'll want to put this in place prior to goose arrival because obviously it's going to affect those flying geese, but they could potentially still walk back and forth. But that's why you want to get that fencing in before geese show up, because then it can discourage them from being there to begin with. Another type of physical barrier that people commonly use are rock barriers. And ideally what this is just doing is impeding easy access to water. If you think about you guys trying to walk over big old rocks, it's not really easy or comfortable. But when you're going to do this, it's important that the rocks are at least 2 feet or larger in diameter. That is going to be the most effective. You still need to make sure you're checking your rules and regulations, especially along those public lakes and those lakes that are managed by other areas other than just HOAs. If you have small rocks, the geese are really easily able to climb over that. And essentially, if the geese are used to people and are being fed by people, the effectiveness of this is absolutely going to be decreased. And that's true for any type of management you're doing, whether it's physical hunting, all those things. If they're being fed, it's probably going to make most things ineffective. Another barrier that people can use is fencing. That blocks access to feeding sites and water. And this is important to get up again too, because in that June and July flight period, they're going to be walking everywhere. And if they're going somewhere where the fence is, they're going to think that they probably need to avoid that area. Of course, the birds can still fly back and forth before their eggs are hatched or before they nest, but you have to think long term as well. You can think about things like using wire, snow fencing, chain link, all these types of options. I've included this picture because this just was like a cheap black fencing. And if you kind of really start looking at it, it kind of starts to blend in with the background. And so it can be a good temporary option, especially like at this site where they're actually working on getting the native vegetation buffer established. If you're using fencing, you can use 120-volt electric fencing. Whatever you do, your opening should be less than 3 inches large, and the fencing should be a minimum of 30 inches tall. Again, putting in prior to nesting, and we already discussed about help with flying. This fence was actually temporarily put in here while this grew up. Once this vegetation was established, this group of people actually chose to take down that fence. Other types of habitat modification, as you can see here, those straight shorelines, those are just perfect for Canada geese. So the more topography you can get around that pond, creating more area. Removing islands and peninsulas, those are very big attractants for geese. If there is a place for turf grass, not all turf grass is bad, but if you're going to have a field or a park, try and keep that at least 450 feet from the water. And then again, going back to those native vegetation barriers. This is our preferred one. It can be trees, shrubs, or other native wildflowers. We like to stress native because that means it has a historical presence in Indiana and it's conditioned to Indiana conditions, so it'll likely survive better. Plus, it provides habitat for other wildlife and pollinators. Essentially, whenever you're creating a vegetation buffer, you really need it to be dense enough so that geese can't easily walk through it. That's what the goal is. And this can be more attractive than other barriers and fences. And when you're going to do this, you want it to be at least 30 inches tall. So I'd say about 3 foot tall plants. And then you want to at least be 20 to 30 feet wide. What I am seeing is in some urban areas, people put houses way too close for that to be feasible, but this is just something to keep in mind. In areas where you can hopefully at least funnel them to a more restrictive area. This is that example that I showed you at the very beginning, but this was a vegetation barrier. This was year 1, 2, and 3. And like I said, if you look at the sidewalk, you can see, I think there's like one spot here, but it's not quite as bad as it was in this picture. Other things to think about, don't allow your domestic waterfowl to be out in the open, because that can actually attract wild waterfowl. Waterfowl attracts waterfowl. Turn off your fountains in the winter if they're not needed, because that open water year-round is another attractant for Canada geese. And then if you have nesting structures, you can take those down, at least temporarily. The final section we're going to talk about is permits. The first one is egg and nest destruction. That happens March 1st through June 30th annually. And then the reports are due back October 31st. It's important to note that this permit is actually not a state permit. This is through the federal department. So you actually have to get online with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you have to fill out the form there, and you have to list your individuals conducting the work, and you have to keep records. You need to make sure you have this permit prior to conducting destruction activities. If you have a nest that's completely empty of eggs or birds, that can be destroyed at any time without a permit. But as soon as a single egg or a bird is sitting on that nest, then you actually need a permit. When you do an egg and nest destruction permit, we do have on our website a how to addle egg brochure. It talks about how you do this float test. And essentially the reason you do this float test is because you're not allowed to addle eggs when they're close to hatching. It's unethical and inhumane. So that's why you look for the right time. You really want to be oiling in this early stage and putting them back in the nest, because that's when the mom will still sit on the nest thinking that they're going to hatch, and when they don't, it's a failed nest, but she's already had her nesting urge satisfied, so hopefully she won't re-nest. When you get to stages 4 and 5, you're likely going to just remove these eggs from the nest at that time. But at stage 6, it's ready to hatch, and you really can't be doing that. And usually when you're addling eggs, you can do either oiling, puncturing, or addling. Either way, it's really important that you have to have a permit ahead of time. I did get a report one time where somebody was just indiscriminately throwing eggs into the lake, and that's not okay. So you really need to make sure you have all your, forgive the pun, but ducks in a row before you start doing egg and nest destruction permits. The other options you have is for trap and relocate, or trap and euthanize permit. This is that form that's going to go strictly through Aaron and I starting this year. You can apply from March 11th through August 31st. All permits expire August 31st for this type of permit, and reports are due back to the 15th. If you're going to pursue this permit, you need to reach out to your biologist to get the form. It has to be filled out completely and sent back to the appropriate biologist for review. The trapping has to occur for large amounts of bird, has to occur during their flightless period. Again, in that June and July period when they're molting their flight feathers and can't go anywhere. If you're trapping and relocating, landowners can choose to try and do that themselves. They will get all the information, but they have to make sure they're meeting the requirements for transportation and humane handling. And then they can relocate those to a list of approved Division of Fish and Wildlife properties. The other option is to trap and euthanize. If that is the option you choose, you must hire a trained waterfowl control operator. They've gone through our courses and have had special training in how to humanely euthanize those birds. And at any and all point, you have to have records kept of the numbers of birds taken, how they were disposed of, and you have to report those leg bans. If you're in an area where you don't have one governing body, you actually have to have a petition signed that shows more than 50% of the people are in favor of doing some type of management plan. The final permit we have it was historically called an egg depredation permit, but I think we typically just call it a shooting permit now. Again, that's also from March 11th through August 31st. Those reports are due back 14 business days after expiration. Anybody on that has to meet hunter education requirements. They have to check their local ordinances, and they cannot be taken in a hunting manner. It's important to know that anytime you get a permit for any wildlife, including geese, a shooting permit is not the same as hunting. Hunting means that someone went out and got a license and is taking that bird animal for use and has paid money to put conservation in. Shooting, there's no money that goes back to those resources. They're just getting taken and removed. So that's an important distinction. And it's not in a sporting manner. It's not, you're not putting out decoys. You're not calling them in. That is not what a shooting permit is. If you act on a shooting permit, that must be disposed or donated to an educational institution or to a charity for human consumption. And again, these are the leg bands that may be on some of those birds, and it's really important to keep track of those and report those back as necessary. Again, we have the waterfowl control operators. They're listed on our website. Some of them can do trap and relocation. Some can do trap and euthanasia. All the waterfowl control operators name their own rates and fees. We don't have any say in what they do for their own businesses. They must have a permit in place prior to doing any goose work. And they have to have that permit on their person before they do it. But it's important to note the landowner is ultimately the person that signs the permit request and is ultimately responsible for everything that goes on. If anything doesn't follow those requirements, we actually send it up the chain to law enforcement and they'll take it from there. So it's really important that we're doing this correctly, safely. And the reason we have all these rules and regulations in place is to keep the animals safe. If you need any resources, you can go to wildlife.in.gov. You can go under the Division of Fish and Wildlife, where we have our list of biologists. We have a page totally devoted to Canada-geese-management. You can find wildlife rehabilitators if there is an issue where you feel like a goose may need a rehabber. And then you can also find the wildlife and waterfowl control operators. And with that, I'll end the presentation and go back to you guys for questions.
All right, so we currently don't have any questions in the chat, but you guys are welcome to drop them in there. Another option, and Jessica, I don't know if you're fine with this, but they can also just hop on and ask the question vocally.
I'm totally fine with that. That works perfect.
Yeah, whichever is easiest for y'all.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your presentation, but the last bit was helpful. Do you have the slides that you were presenting that I could review later?
Morgan mentioned at the beginning, we're going to actually record this and it will be up on our website later.
Great, thank you.
Any questions, folks? You don't need to be shy.
Yep. Maybe.
We have a question here. Out of the type of permits or tactics used, what are the most common? The shooting permit or the trap and euthanasia or trap and relocate? Can you talk to us about that a bit?
That's really dependent upon each individual landowner and where you're located. For obviously farmers, the shooting one's more popular, especially in those rural areas. In more urban areas, it just depends. Some people want trap and euthanize, some people want trap and relocate.
If they are migrating birds, what is the usefulness of relocation if they're just going to migrate again?
You've hit that on the nose. Some people, I'm trying to think of the best way of putting it. It's there as an option in case people don't like the idea of euthanizing the birds. Ideally, they have really strong homing instincts, so if they've already hatched and keep going, it is still possible they'll come back. Some people believe that the further away you take them, they'll less likely come back, but we have seen examples where that's just not the case. Essentially, and it kind of goes back, I guess I can touch on this a little bit more. It kind of goes back, those permits are really a temporary relief. Harassment and permit, those are just temporary relief issues. If you really want to get at the root of the problem, you have to have a really good management plan and think about changing the behaviors of people in the area, as well as potentially changing the habitat a little bit and having a new way of thinking to really get at the longer management plan. Because essentially, just because, let's say, for example, you did remove and relocate those birds to one area, that doesn't mean other birds won't potentially find that open spot of water.
Have you observed any differences between ducks and geese and E. coli and the effect on humans or properties? Is there any difference there between those two species?
I don't have a lot of expertise in this, but everything that I have currently discussed with the waterfowl biologist, specifically regarding Canada goose and mallard droppings, there's just not good research that shows high transmission from the birds to humans. I'm assuming there's probably some level of E. coli to the lake, but as far as directly from the birds to humans in the feces, you'd probably have to go to your health department for that research.
Okay, we've got another question. Just one second.
Partially destroy a nest, do you still need a permit?
Did you hear that question?
I did not hear all of it.
If you only partially destroy a nest, do you still need a permit?
What do you mean by partially disturbing a nest?
If you leave a couple of eggs.
If you leave a couple of eggs in the nest.
If there's anything in that nest, you need a permit. If you touch that nest at all, you need a permit.
Okay.
I think Debbie had a question about like green laser.
You may go ahead and read that off, or
Yeah, so Debbie asked, I found the green laser to be effective harassment. Why does that work? I don't fully know actually all the science behind that. If Erin's on and she has more information, feel free to add. But from my understanding, it's just that green light, potentially predator eyes, and then just the fact that there's something that's bothering them and they don't want to be there. Erin is typing, so she might have more to add.
any other questions, folks?
Yes, we have another question here.
So there's a Senate Bill 389 going through right now at the state level. What's the concern for the Canada goose population with regards to that being passed and in favor of wetland construction?
So the question is, did you hear that one, Jessica?
I heard parts of it.
Okay. So as many of us know, Senate Bill 389 is looking like it's probably going to get passed, which would favor wetland destruction potentially. Are you guys at all concerned about the effects of that bill on Canada geese population?
Morgan or Erin, feel free to jump in, but I would imagine the same concerns go for any wetland species, that it's just going to loss of habitat. That's the biggest concern. And it does eventually trickle down to Canada geese as well.
The Indiana Department of Natural Resources and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management have been at those meetings as well, and you can see the recordings online for more information. We do have another question in the chat box. Are the number of geese increasing in our area? Are we getting to the point that will require more management, or are we at healthy numbers right now?
Erin, feel free to chime in, because I think you're there with Adam's latest presentation about, Adam is our waterfowl biologist, for those who don't know. From my understanding, we do have healthy populations of birds in Indiana. There's not really concern that there's too many geese at this point. What happens is just in certain areas, we have those artificial increases from things like creating habitat, feeding them, those types of things. So it's not necessarily a statewide increase, it's just a local area increase more than it is a statewide change.
Oh, Erin, I'll just add it in the chat just so everybody can hear it. For the green laser question, she said she doesn't have anything to add, but she's also heard that they're effective. Any other questions? You guys are coming up with really good ones.
And I think Erin's working on a response.
Yeah.
Yes, we have one more question back here.
So the private landowner is allowed to decide what to do with geese on their land, but like in public areas, like who gets to decide what to do if there's complaints about geese in like parks and like what's the most common action?
Yeah, so this question has to do with private and public property. You mentioned that people can take private action if they're the landowner. What happens when there's complaints about geese on public land?
In public land, it still goes back to who is the landowner. So we do have people from different parks departments that actually submit permits. It just goes back to who is the governing body and who is allowed to make those management decisions.
Thank you.
And Erin did say in the chat, urban areas tend to have lots of retention ponds and bases, which is perfect habitat for geese. So I think she was just supporting that there's not really an increase overall number, just maybe a local population increase from different things in urban areas that contribute to those favorable conditions for Canada geese.
Related to that, are there more geese that aren't migrating now compared to historically?
So there's currently a study going on right now through Indiana. We just finished our first year of study and they're still working on publishing all their results. But what they're showing right now is what we thought were permanent resident geese. They're actually new groups of geese coming through. Because unfortunately, Canada geese look like Canada geese, and unless you have the band number to truly identify that that's the same goose every time, it's looking more and more like they're just different groups that keep passing through at different times.
Local biologists, but I keep hearing that around the lakes here around Syracuse that we're overpopulated with geese. What's the biggest threat? Are we worried about, are they just a nuisance, or are they a threat to other wildlife or the water?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not exactly sure what the threat is.
Yeah. So when goose populations become really high, like what's been observed here on Syracuse Lake, which is actually right outside the window here, what's the biggest threat? Is it just that they're a nuisance, or the E. coli, or other native animals? What's the biggest threat of having those bigger populations?
That's really up to the landowner to determine, because there's the biological carrying capacity, which you know, that's how many the population can naturally sustain, but it's if people think that there's an issue, that's when it becomes an issue. So it depends. Some people are concerned about the health aspects. Some people, they're not really caring about the larger group. They're just worried about the two mating right by the front door, and they're worried about people tripping on those birds and safety there. Some people have complained about the noise. It's really varied. I don't think there's necessarily a large threat to local wildlife. I think it's just more of either the perceived or experienced conflicts that people have with Canada geese, more so than it is an actual worry for the environment itself.
Here's a good question. Do Canada geese have any redeeming qualities about them?
Absolutely. They're a valued member of our native wildlife. They provide recreational opportunity. They are there as, some people simply just love looking at them. It's really, you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. You know, a lot of people think mute swans are gorgeous, but they're really invasive species. So if they looked like an Asian carp, people would probably have a much different attitude towards mute swans. But Canada geese, they're beautiful native things. They contribute to the ecosystem, and there's always wildlife that belongs to the ecosystem, and they all interplay together. Erin might have more to add to that, or Morgan too.
I think you pretty much nailed it, Jessica. Just so you know.
We have 897 species of wildlife in Indiana, and if we don't learn how to integrate our urban areas and our rural areas to support all the wildlife, it's going to get really boring if every animal looks the same.
Yep. We do have another question here.
Absolutely.
Is there a program in place to reduce the mute swans?
Is there a program in place to reduce mute swans like the Canada geese?
There is not. So mute swans are actually considered a nuisance animal in Indiana, which means if they are causing damage or threatening to cause damage to a person or property, that landowner or tenant can remove that bird at any time without a permit. In situations like you said, I think you said Syracuse Lake, Wawasee, whichever lake, I think they're connected anyway, right? If it's a lake association that has multiple people interested in those mute swans, that lake association board is going to need to fill out a nuisance wild animal control permit request, which is actually separate from the waterfowl permit. And they have to fill out that permit request, and that goes to our permit specialist, and then they will make the decision about the permit for that.
Okay, I think those are all of our questions here at the Lilly Center.
Perfect. And definitely at any point, if someone, maybe they're shy or just don't want to, feel free to reach out to me, Morgan. If you don't like one of us, we do have like a general inquiry place. So we can definitely put you in contact with the right person.
Yeah, if you're just wanting to contact anyone, our general inbox is just dfw@dnr.in.gov, and you guys are welcome to, it doesn't even have to be about geese. It could just be about fish or wildlife too. We'll answer your questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay.
Oh, I think we do have one more question.
Okay.
Are mute swans something that we can encourage or increase in the area? I mean not the mute swan, the whistling swan.
Are the whistling swans the kind that we can encourage around here to get their populations up?
Did you mean trumpeter swan?
Trumpeter, yes, yep.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
Another friend.
Yeah.
There's tons of waterfowl.
Yeah, there's a ton of waterfowl. Definitely, trumpeter swans are definitely to be encouraged. They're good for the environment. They're beautiful birds. I think we're starting to see some nesting success of trumpeter swans coming back to Indiana, which is fantastic. So trumpeter swans themselves, yes, they are very good. They're native, and they are not like the mute swan counterpart, which is horrible and destructive.
In what way?
How do the trumpeter swans relate to Canadian geese?
How do trumpeter swans relate to Canadian geese?
So
Either ecologically or have you seen them have any interactions between their populations?
I have not seen direct between trumpeter and Canada geese. They both coexist in wetlands. So I guess I don't know if that answers the question or if you were looking for something a little bit different there.
No, that's good. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jessica, and your crew.
Thank you guys for having me. And if, like I mentioned before, if you guys need something else, feel free to hit me up. And maybe, if you need an in-person meeting or something like that, that's something I could potentially facilitate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all so much for attending, and we'll have this on our website at a later time.